A special conversation with the one and only James Baker.
I don't see our government getting things done for the people anymore.
The ultimate DC dealmaker talks about life inside the White House for Trump, Bush, and Reagan.
One of the secrets, I think, to Ronald Reagan's political success is that he was consistently underestimated.
And he's speaking out against the growing protests by star athletes.
I just think it's outrageous. There are plenty of ways that you can call into question some of the racism that may still exist in this country, but that's the wrong way to do it.
Welcome to the Axe Files.
Secretary Baker, we're here in your office at the Baker Institute at Rice University. Wonderful institution you started here. It is good to be with you. You know, we work different sides of the political tracks. We work for different presidents, but man, what a record. You had 5 presidential campaigns you led, Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of State. So I'm here for your wisdom. You're Yoda, and I need your wisdom. What is happening in our politics today? When you watch what you're seeing in Washington, what do you think?
Well, I'm not sure I can tell you exactly what's happening, except it's very regrettable what I see happening. I don't see our government getting things done for the people anymore. Back in the days when I was there with Reagan and Bush, Ronald Reagan had a Democratic House for his 2 terms. George Bush had a Democratic House and Democratic Senate, and those presidents found ways to work with the Congress.
You were the object of a lot of suspicion on the part of the base of the Republican Party that elected Ronald Reagan, because he also was someone who challenged the Republican establishment, and you were seen as the establishment's man in the White House. Those divisions seem to be even wider today.
They are wider today. I was the establishment's man in the White House. I had worked for Jerry Ford. I had run 2 campaigns against Ronald Reagan. But you talk about broad gauge. Here's a president who he's so broad gauge that he can overlook the fact that someone has run 2 campaigns against him and ask him to be his White House chief of staff. And it's, you know, we don't see that anymore. The objective back in those days was to get things done. That always involves, as you well know, having been in there, it involves compromise. It involves sitting down and working things out. We don't see that happening anymore.
In the Alabama Senate primary for the seat that Jeff Sessions gave up to become Attorney General, the president has endorsed one candidate. Steve Bannon, who was his chief strategist, up until a few weeks ago, went on the day before the election and campaigned for the other candidate.
Right.
Could you have imagined such a thing in your day?
No, I couldn't.
And what does it say to you about the coherence of the party itself and the ability to govern? Because they seem to be running a campaign, at least the Bannonites, against the Senate Majority Leader, who's a Republican.
Well, I think that's a big mistake, of course, but parties need to unify in order to get things done. The party structure is never really strong. I mean, I think that happens on both sides, that the parties are not what they used to be back in the early 1900s or the 1800s. But they're still very important. But I can't conceive of a situation where someone would work in Reagan or George Bush's White House at a high level and then go out and campaign against a candidate that the president had endorsed. I bet you can't.
No, it wouldn't have happened.
Either in your White House. No. So it's very unusual. But there are
How would you feel about it if you were the president?
That a lot of things are. Well, I don't know. I wouldn't feel particularly good about it. I would say, hey, wait a minute, pal. I gave you a chance to come into the White House and sit at a very high level in the American government, and I wouldn't ask too much of you, but I would ask that much loyalty from you.
I know that you are you're a master diplomat, and you can be very diplomatic. But I want to ask you, you had a rule when you were the White House Chief of Staff, and that was don't start any fights you can't win, and win all the fights that you start. That doesn't seem to be the operative theory in this White House?
Well, I don't think it is the operative theory. Now, why that is, I can't tell you, except that I think this president has had a career of accomplishment that required him to strike back at his opponents. And so you never see a situation where he isn't going to want to hit back at someone that he thinks has wronged him. I think, as a matter of fact, that could make it a lot more difficult to get anything done. You need the congressional leadership if you're going to get legislation, and we judge our presidents by what they have, by how much of their policy goals they accomplish and move into law. So it's very difficult to conceive of getting a lot done if your own party leadership in the Congress is opposed to you.
One of the things that you got done with President Reagan was probably the only genuine tax reform since the income tax was implemented in 1913, back in 1986. How did you pull that off, and do you think it's possible today?
It was a Democratic bill, and our House Republicans didn't want to vote for it, and they rebelled against President Reagan. And it was not until President Reagan went up to the Hill and sat down with them and finally got them to agree, okay. So the president went up there, and he spent the first 40 minutes talking about the tragic accident at Fort Myer and the wonderful, brave American men and women who'd been killed and so forth and so on. And then after about 30, 40 minutes, he said, and now, fellas, he said, I want to talk to you about the tax bill. And there was not a dry eye in the House. and we got the bill passed through the House, a Democratic bill, and we did fix it in the Senate, and it helped the country.
You know, I worked for a president who also was very charismatic, an inspiring speaker, and when he was trying to pass difficult legislation, the health care bill being one of them, he would go up and speak to the caucus. He never had text in front of him. It was just him. And Reagan was, it sounds like the same, that he just went in the room and let it.
Well, oftentimes Reagan would use note cards, but not on these kind of occasions. He was a wonderful communicator.
Yeah, underestimated. I think there's this sense that he read speeches well.
No.
He wrote them.
He wrote those speeches, and there's a sense that. And by the way, he wrote a lot of his letters.
Yes.
I've still got the rough draft in his own handwriting of his letter to Brezhnev. Lifting the grain embargo on the Soviet Union. I mean, he did a lot of this on his own. One of the secrets, I think, to Ronald Reagan's political success is that he was consistently underestimated. And as you know, as a good politician, exceeding expectations is the key in politics.
And he knew he was.
Yeah. Yep.
On the subject of letters, Abraham Lincoln had a habit of, when he wrote a letter in anger, he would stick it in the drawer, and he would not, and he would look at it a week later and decide whether he actually wanted to send the letter. We live in the age of Twitter now, and the president is an active participant on Twitter. How do you evaluate that in terms of his abilities as a president to get stuff done?
Well, a lot of people will tell you they think it's counterproductive. It, of course, has worked for him in the private sector, which is why he does it.
Well, and in the campaign.
And in the campaign, it worked for him, which is why he continues to do it. It's a little, you know, running a business and running the government are two entirely different undertakings. The one thing that I would worry about if I were one of his senior officials would be not knowing until 2:30 or 3 in the morning when you see the most recent tweet, what the policy was. Because when a president of the United States speaks, he speaks policy. He's creating policy. He's making policy. But it worked for him. In the campaign, it worked for him in business. Who's to say it won't work? But I will tell you this, if I were Secretary of State, it would make my job a lot harder, or Secretary of Defense, or whatever whatever official it might be.
Yeah.
That's not to say that it won't work for him. It may very well.
Well, you were Secretary of State, so put your Secretary of State hat on, and you sort of implied this. Let's take North Korea as an example. He's been in a pretty brisk exchange of taunts with Kim Jong-un, the ruler of North Korea. Mm-hmm. How would you, as Secretary of State, advise him? And is this a good path to take? Do you have?
It could be, but it depends on what else is going to come with it. There's nothing wrong with knocking this guy, even though when the President of the United States does it personally himself, it sort of builds the guy up bigger than he's entitled to be, in my view. I got a solution for North Korea, but I don't know whether we'll ever get there. But what I think we ought to do is send someone who is well respected by the Chinese government and who can speak to them on a very private and confidential basis. I know I'm talking about it here publicly, but you could do it privately and confidentially. It'll have to be someone who can get in and out of there without, he can't have all the fanfare and so forth of a government official. And sit down with the Chinese and say, hey, you don't want a nuclear Korean Peninsula, and they don't like what this guy is doing there, and we don't want it. So why don't we make this agreement? We, the United States, will support any government you put in North Korea, install in North Korea, that renounces nuclear weapons, that won't seek to develop them or maintain them. And we will agree with you that if that happens, we will sign a peace treaty ending the Korean War, and we will agree we won't station nukes in South Korea on the Korean Peninsula. And you get rid of this flake, and he is a flake. So I don't see anything wrong with the president calling attention to the fact that he's flaky, but that's the.
Do you think he's pushing him to the point where there could be a misunderstanding?
Well, I hope there wouldn't be, but I don't think that it's. I don't think it's a case of our president pushing that. You don't need to push him very far. Look what he's doing. He's firing off these missiles over Japan and violating their airspace and everything. And he's doing it very provocatively, and the Chinese don't like it either. Nobody likes what he's doing. Everybody opposes this. So
I just on the tweet question itself, I totally identify with you as someone who worked for a president. I don't think I would sleep if my president were tweeting policy at all hours of the day and night. And I asked Sean Spicer right before he took the job about this, and he was about to become press secretary. I said, "Do you know what he's going to tweet?" He said, "No." And I said, "How do you sleep?" He said, "I sleep okay, but I get up very early and look at my phone to see what the story of the day is going to be."
That's correct. No, that's correct.
Yeah.
And it's like a campaign. It's like running the government's not unlike running a campaign. There needs to be message discipline. Now, the president is the one who's going to set the message. So I suppose you can have message discipline that begins at 5 a.m. and runs through that day. But in a campaign, if you don't have message discipline, you may not win. In running the government, it's important to have message.
Well, and in fact, government, yes, there are elements of campaign discipline that's necessary in government. You brought that to the Reagan White House. There were plenty of people who wanted him to take up issues that were not the major issues that he needed to get done. And you were pretty steadfast in standing there. That was one of the reasons why the conservatives thought you were...
That's correct. Not letting Reagan be Reagan. How insulting is that?
It strikes me even today, and maybe more so today, that if you were to kind of look for you would be like a poster child for what this activist Republican base hates. You know, you believe in global institutions, you believe in trade, You believe in climate change. You believe in a resolution.
No, you go too far there. I think the climate may be changing, but I do not have any idea the extent to which man is responsible for it. And by the way, I and some of my fellow conservatives have come with a very good proposal involving a carbon tax with dividends back to the American people so it doesn't grow the government. But I understand what you're saying. And yes, that's...
Does it bother you?
No. Does it bother me that I would be a poster child?
No. For the group that really is...
No, because while they're for those things you said, and I may be in a different position, they're also for getting things done. And what we were able to do in Ronald Reagan's administration and George H.W. Bush's administration is get things done for the American people. They're for tax reform. They are they're for health care reform. They're for some solution to the immigration problem. So they're for these things which are not getting done. So
can you get things done? Can you make deals anymore in Washington? You know, the president made a couple of deals with Pelosi and Schumer.
Yeah.
That created a little bit of uneasiness among his base. I assume you would think that was a good thing.
I do. If you're going to govern in Washington, D.C., if you're going to get things accomplished, you're going to end up at some point having to reach across the aisle to make it happen. And so, without judging the specifics of those deals he made with Schumer and Pelosi, I think that is a good deal. What's wrong with getting things done in a bipartisan way? That was one of the keys to the success of Ronald Reagan's presidency and George Bush's presidency.
Next on the Axe File.
You were in the White House during one of the most dramatic and unsettling events of recent history, and that was the assassination attempt on President Reagan. You were only there for 70 days as Chief of Staff when this happened. Recall for me what that was like. I can't imagine sitting in the White House and getting that news.
Well, it was devastating news, of course, because we didn't know, first of all, whether the president had been hit. The first reports were he hadn't been hit. Then we get a report that he's not only been hit, he's on his way to George Washington Hospital. So we left the White House and went right to the hospital. And the president, of course, never lost his sense of humor. You know, the quips that he gave as they wheeled him in on the gurney, and he looked at the doctors and said, "I hope you're all Republicans." And then Nancy shows up and he looks at her and says, "Honey, I'm sorry, I forgot to duck."
Were you there then?
Yeah, I went to the hospital immediately. I had not gone on the event. I got Mike Deaver, the Deputy Chief of Staff, to take my place because I had a lot of stuff I had to do in the White House, so I didn't go to the event.
You were supposed to go. You might have been right in the line of fire.
I might very well have been. Poor Jim Brady got shot in the
press secretary.
In the head, the press secretary. Yeah.
What ensued over the next 24 hours was questions about protocol, who was in charge. There was a newly enacted 25th Amendment.
Yeah.
And you could have declared him incapacitated.
We could have invoked the 25th Amendment. We made it. I may have made a mistake here. I got criticized for it in the aftermath, but I don't think it was a mistake. I concluded that we ought not to invoke the 25th Amendment. The doctors had told us that they were going to take the president into surgery. They're going to remove this bullet, and that he would be under anesthesia for maybe 4 or 5 hours. And so Ed Meese and I, who was a counselor to the president and had been his chief of staff in California, and I decided in a broom closet in George Washington Hospital that we wouldn't invoke the 25th Amendment.
Why?
Because I was in favor of not invoking it because I had been George Bush's campaign manager. I had
the vice president.
The vice president, and President Reagan had asked me then to be his chief of staff. Something, by the way, that I don't think will ever happen again in American politics. But I was viewed with some suspicion by some of the Reagan people, because I'd run these two campaigns against Reagan, one for Ford and then one for George Bush, and I just thought it would look like usurpation of power. Vice President Bush was not in favor of it, as best I know. He was in Texas flying back. And so we opted not to do it. The president was operated on, came out in good shape 4 or 5 hours later, and that's the story.
One of the things that really intrigued me, having worked in a White House, was that you cut a deal with Ed Meese when you became chief of staff, a written agreement as to what everybody's authorities and responsibilities were. I noticed when I read the document, and it's a fascinating document, that you derogated to yourself the authority to appoint, the authority over the president's schedule, the authority over what paper came in and out of the Oval Office. It struck me that you took every responsibility that went to actual control of what happened in the White House. I'm giving you credit, man. I think it was a great deal.
I took the political side of the White House. Ed wanted to be in policy. And by the way, let me tell you something. I have no better friend, really, than Ed Meese. He's a wonderful person and a close friend. Yes, there were tensions in our White House between his so-called camp and mine, but it all worked well for the Gipper. I mean, he got all sorts of views. On this document you're talking about, what happened was the night of the election, when we found out we'd won, President Reagan said, "Jim, before you go back to Texas, I want to talk to you." And so I went to see him, and he said, "I would like you to be my chief of, the next morning, I'd like you to be my chief of staff, but make it right with Ed." Because Ed had been chief of staff in California, everybody assumed he was going to be the chief of staff. And so I called Ed, and he was obviously down about the decision, and I said, "Let's go to breakfast." And we went to breakfast, and he wanted to be in charge of policy. And I said, "Okay, I'll be in charge of politics and making the trains run on time." And that's what that document.
Yeah, but the truth is that when you make, I mean, you're talking to a guy who spent time in the White House, so I know how things work. The guy who makes the trains run on time has a lot to say about everything, including policy, because what the president sees and what the president does really reflects his priorities.
Well,
you knew that.
Most importantly, press, communications, and Congress. Because Congress, you got to get, if you're going to get your policies implemented into law with any permanence, executive orders work great. That's great, but they can be undone, as we're seeing right now. Your executive orders are being undone by the.
Well, they weren't mine, but
no, I mean, but your president's, your president's executive.
My executive orders weren't worth much. There was one incident that you've written about that I thought was pretty interesting, that spoke to how fraught relations were. And in any White House, there are tensions, but where the National Security Advisor suggested that all of you take polygraph tests to see if you were guilty of leaking. That didn't sit well with you.
No. Well, first of all, the President had given me, specifically given me in an order, the authority to order polygraphs if they were going to be ordered, or to recommend to the Justice Department and so forth. And so that was done without my knowledge. And I was on my way to lunch in downtown. I got word of it, and I turned the car around, and I walked back in the Oval, and the president was having lunch with the vice president and Secretary of State at that time, George Shultz, and he'd ordered this polygraph on anybody who was in a particular NSC
meeting.
The
president?
The president had, on the recommendation of his National Security Advisor, Bill Clark. And of course, it didn't make any sense at all to do that. What do you can't strap up, you're going to strap up the Vice President of the United States? He's a constitutional officer. And George Shultz quickly said, "Well, Mr. President, I'll take the lie detector test if that's what you want, but it'll be the last thing I do as your Secretary of State." And the president then realized that this was a mistake, and it never should have gone to him. Through Bill Clark. The authority for that was something that was in my court in the White House.
You mentioned earlier that your wife had died when you were relatively young, but You came to politics after that. You were older. I was 5 when John F. Kennedy came to my little housing development in New York City campaigning, and I thought, this is the coolest thing ever. This is what I want to be involved in. You had no notion of a career in politics.
No, in fact, I expressly, I had been advised by my grandfather's mantra, if you want to be a good lawyer, work hard, study, and stay out of politics. And for 40 years of my life, I stayed out of politics. And then my wife got sick. The last people to see her, other than family, before she died were George and Barbara Bush. Came to see her. We were close friends. And George came to me after she died and said, Bake, you gotta get your mind off your grief. Help me run for the Senate here in Texas. I said, well, George, that's great, except I don't know anything about politics, and I'm a Democrat. He said, well, we can change that last thing, and I changed to become. Of
course, Texas Democrats were different then.
In those days, I was really a Republican philosophically.
You just didn't know it.
Conservative. Well, conservative Democrats, which is what I was, were really Republicans. And it was shortly thereafter that they began to vote Republican. And now, of course, as you know, Texas is a solidly Republican state.
Ahead on the Axe Files.
Let me ask you about that 1988 campaign, because I always point to that campaign, and I'm not saying this judgmentally. There was a brilliant negative campaign run. I know you recoil from that in your book, but the truth of the matter is, as a practitioner, you guys were 17 points behind in the summer of 1988, and embarked on a campaign that Roger Ailes oversaw, an advertising campaign.
Advertising with Roger.
Yes, and it was brutal and it was effective. And one of those ads, an outside group ad, was about this issue.
Outside group.
I understand. The Willie Horton ad was an outside ad.
Dukakis not only opposes the death penalty, he allowed first-degree murderers to have weekend passes from prison. One was Willie Horton, who murdered a boy in a robbery, stabbing him 19 times. Despite a life sentence, Horton received 10 weekend passes from prison.
The Willie Horton ad was very searing. And it ran about the same time. And it clearly was, you said in the book that there was a backlash, but it was effective, and it was a play on race. I mean, Lee Atwater.
Well, guess who wrote them a letter and told them to stop it? Me.
Yeah.
And they stopped it.
Yeah.
But now,
after a few weeks.
But David, I know, I admire what you did in your campaign, and you were very, very effective. But look, Michael Dukakis, in a debate, when he was asked if someone broke into his house, murdered his wife, and raped her, if he would then support the death penalty, and he said no.
If Kitty Dukakis were raped and murdered, would you favor an irrevocable death penalty for the killer?
No, I don't, Bernard, and I think you know that I've opposed the death penalty during all of my life.
We didn't have anything to do with that.
No, I understand. I'm not, and listen, I've thrown hard punches in my career, so I'm not, but I'm interested in the issue of race. Lee Atwater, who was a great political tactician, and was one of your, he was manager before you came back. He was really central to that campaign. Said when he was dying some years after that he regretted that, and he said he regretted saying, we're going to strip the bark off of the little bastard and make Willie Horton his running mate. So, look, politics ain't beanbag.
Very colorful language.
Politics ain't beanbag. I understand that. The reason I raise it now, and the other issue that came up in that campaign, was the American flag, and because Dukakis had vetoed a piece of legislation that would have compelled teachers to,
which is not a particularly smart political move.
Right?
Wouldn't you agree?
I would certainly agree with that.
Wouldn't you also agree that putting on that goofy-looking helmet and riding around in that tank?
I'm not here to. I'm not
had nothing to do.
Not here to suggest the Dukakis campaign was a model of strategic achievement, but the flag race. It seems very current right now because the president has started this has picked up this issue about Colin Kaepernick.
Yeah.
It is racially tinged, the flag and race. You guys use this as a tactic to win a campaign, but you didn't raise these issues when the president was in office. It wasn't the themes that he picked up and took into office. Do you have concerns about the tone?
He sure took the flag issue into office.
Yeah, but no, everybody supports the flag. Let's assert that. But I'm just trying to trace back sort of this issue of the manipulation of these kinds of very, very incendiary things. And does it concern you that the president is spending his time on these things now?
Well, I think it's important to get immigration reform, health care reform, tax reform. Those are the things that I think he ought to be spending his time on. And I'm not saying...
Is this a distraction from that?
I don't know. I'm not in that White House. Ask that question to General Kelly.
Well, you speak to him more than I do. You should ask him that question.
Who has been empowered. Ask him that question. But you know, I think this issue that we're confronting today, I watched Monday Night Football. I thought it was handled very, very well by both teams, by the NFL. They went out, they showed unity with all their players, took a knee, but not during the national anthem, not to denigrate our country and our flag. I mean, I just think it's outrageous. There are plenty of ways that you can call into question some of the racism that may still exist in this country, but that's the wrong way to do it. You don't denigrate. The one thing that used to, and I hope it still will, unify us is that we're all Americans. I think identity politics is really bad, David. And I know we play it and you play it. And I think that's one of the problems that's affected our polity. We ought to get away from identity politics. We're all Americans.
But isn't part of what being an American means? I mean, I'm the son of an immigrant, so my father came here from Eastern Europe.
So am I.
But he came here because he had the freedom to worship as he pleased, and to think as he pleased,
right,
and to express himself. Colin Kaepernick was expressing a sentiment that many, many people in the community feel about injustice, about the problems within our criminal justice system that are deeply felt, and he drew attention to them. He made clear that he wasn't protesting the military, the flag. He was exercising the rights that the flag offered.
You can't tell me that not standing up for the national anthem with your hand over your heart is not denigrating the national anthem or the flag. It is.
Well,
I mean, there are plenty of ways for him to protest.
Yeah, but he chose a way that was effective because it brought to light a way in which we aren't meeting our national values, the meaning of the flag.
Well, we don't have time, but we could sit here and argue that all day. You were a very effective campaign manager and White House assistant to the first African-American president.
Yes.
With an African-American attorney general, 2 of them. Mm-hmm. I mean, and to say we're not making progress in race relations, come on.
I didn't say we're not making progress.
I chaired a commission.
I didn't say that. I didn't say that, Mr. Secretary. I know we are. I've felt it. I see it. But if you're a person on the streets of the inner cities of our country,
sure, there's still
you're in a different position than an Eric Holder or Barack Obama, and they would be the first to say so.
Granted. I guess what I'm getting to is, you know, I worked very collaboratively with President Jimmy Carter when I was Secretary of State. We would never have been able to end the wars in El Salvador and Nicaragua had it not been for Jimmy Carter. He and I were asked to co-chair a presidential commission on a federal election reform. And we proposed, get this now, we proposed photo IDs to vote. And you know why? Because President Carter said, and I totally agreed, if a minority has a government-issued photo ID, very few voting registrars are ever going to try to deny them the right to vote. But now, you'd think that photo IDs to vote were the worst thing in the world. That's bad that we've done that. I mean,
well, let me back up for a second. Just put a button on this because I want to ask you about a few other things here. We could talk about this.
Yeah, we could
all day. You said both sides play identity politics.
Yeah.
Were you guys playing identity politics in '88 when the Willie Horton?
I don't think we were, but a lot of people do. And if we were not doing anything that you all don't do either on your side.
Yeah. So, and look, like I say, there are no angels in this very, very hard Scrabble arena that you and I have both chosen. But reflecting back and on the nature of our campaigns, especially in this media age, do we contribute to the coarsening of our politics? When we play the game, winning is the thing. You can't govern if you don't win. You're very good at winning and you're good at governing. But is there something that we have to take responsibility for in terms of the nature of our debates?
Well, I think so. But if you compare our debates, our political debates today with those of the 18th, 19th century, they're mild by comparison in many respects.
Coming up on the Axe Files.
Amid everything else you have here, you have this incredible artifact of history that is pretty rare.
It's a segment of the Berlin Wall. It's got a plaque on it here, which I'll read to you. The Berlin Wall separated the world of oppression from the world of freedom from 1961 to 1989. It was taken down by the heroic people of East and West Germany. On November 10, 1989, President George H.W. Bush and Secretary of State James A. Baker III led America's foreign policy during this revolutionary time and during the subsequently successful effort to unify Germany in peace and freedom.
I read that you were in a luncheon at the State Department with Corazon Aquino, the president of the Philippines, and someone passed you a note.
What the note said was the East German government has opened up the border between East and West Germany. So I took my leave of the president of the Philippines and went back over to the White House to meet with the president.
What did that mean to you?
Well, it meant that the world as I'd known it all my adult life changed, and changed fundamentally. I mean, the Cold War was clearly over, and that's all I'd known. You know, when I was a school kid growing up, we'd hide under our desk because of the threat of nuclear war. And this was extraordinary. And by the way, David, nobody saw it coming. Nobody saw it coming. It happened, boom, like that.
You know, the world was dangerous, but was easier to navigate in certain ways when there were two superpowers.
Yeah, you knew foreign policy was pretty easy to formulate. If the Soviets were for it, we were against it. If we were for it, they were against it. It was easier in that respect. Yeah. But let's not make any mistake. There should be no nostalgia for the Cold War. Regardless of what problems there are out there today, the Cold War was a terribly difficult experience, and every president, from Harry Truman through George H.W. Bush, Republican and Democratic, deserve credit for the fact that we triumphed.
You were the Secretary of State when the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union imploded. Today, our relationship with Russia is about as bad as it's been in a very long time. What happened?
Well, I don't know exactly that you can pinpoint it on one thing, but for 15 years after the implosion of the Soviet Union, the United States and the West generally had really good relations with Russia. They were associate members of NATO under both Yeltsin and Putin, by the way, until about 2004, 2005. And then I don't know what specifically what caused it. I think the Russian position changed. I think maybe he got in domestic political trouble in Russia. You know, you're a good politician.
All politics is local. That's what your friend Tip O'Neill said.
All politics is local, and if you can point to somebody else and say this terrible person in this other country is causing us all these problems, that's pretty good domestic politics.
How concerned are you about the hacking issue, not just here, but
I
in
think
Europe?
that's something to be very, very concerned about. Absolutely.
You accept that the conclusion of the intelligence community that Russia was hacking in our election. You think the president should just embrace that and move on?
No, I'm not going to. That's hypothetical, and I'm not going to make it.
No, it's not hypothetical.
Well, I don't know whether he should or not. I mean, I guess reasonable minds could question that, but I don't. I think if all the intelligence agencies say that they hacked us, I think they hacked us.
And then it's incumbent on the president and the government to do something about it proactively.
To do something about it. Well, but incumbent upon all of our governments to do something about it. We haven't done it.
How's you're friendly with Secretary Tillerson, fellow Texan. Do you think he's playing in the administration? How is his voice being heard?
Well, I don't know really the extent to which the president has empowered him. I would hope that he would empower him, because that's the way you achieve foreign policy successes. You got to have one person who's clearly in charge of foreign policy, formulation and implementation of it. The statutes say that's supposed to be the Secretary of State. But there are other envoys in this administration, other people in charge of some part of the foreign policy portfolio. So we'll have to see how it plays.
Concern to you?
Well, it would be if I were there, because I had the very best situation anybody could ever have. My president was a 40-year friend. He was godfather to my daughter. I'd run all his political campaigns. So when I went out in the world and said something, people knew I was speaking for the president.